He walked slowly down the street, his shoulders hunched against the weight of judgmental stares that followed his every step. In 3 years of wandering the city's streets, Jim had grown painfully accustomed to people's harsh remarks and whispered comments. "Aren't you ashamed? Such a young man, homeless. Go find yourself some work." Though Jim never stooped to begging or panhandling, the signs of his life on the streets were unmistakably evident. Threadbare clothes hanging loosely on his frame, a week's worth of dark stubble covering his gaunt face, and a distant, lost look haunting his tired eyes. Despite his determined efforts to maintain some semblance of dignity by meticulously washing his shabby clothes in the cold river water during the warmer months, and occasionally treating himself to visits to the public baths when he could scrape together enough coins for a ticket, the cruel label of vagrant seemed permanently affixed to his existence. In truth, he had never known the warmth of a real home. His mother had abandoned him at the maternity hospital. The reason for her devastating choice remained an aching mystery that tormented Jim. As a lonely child in the crowded orphanage, he'd spent countless nights crafting elaborate fantasies where one day she would suddenly appear, tears streaming down her face, and exclaim with joy, "Son, I've been searching for you for so long." In his most cherished daydreams, he imagined he'd been stolen from her arms at birth, creating a noble explanation for her absence. But these were nothing more than the desperate dreams of an unwanted child. She never came through those gates, never offered an explanation, never whispered an apology. No one seemed to want him. While some of the other boys were fortunate enough to find new families, Jim remained perpetually overlooked. He was painfully unremarkable in every way. No striking blue eyes to catch attention, no angelic, wavy hair to charm potential parents, no endearing freckles to make him memorable. Just hair the colour of last year's straw, and eyes of an indeterminate greyish that reminded everyone of a dusty wall in need of fresh paint. His personality wasn't particularly sweet or engaging either, prickly as a defensive hedgehog, always hovering on the periphery, preferring to be alone. And finally finishing school, he desperately yearned to join the army. Military service represented more than just a duty. It was his chance to completely transform his life, prove his worth to society, and explore the vast expanse of his country. But even this modest dream crumbled to dust when the stern-faced doctor at the medical commission rejected his application. His flat feet and seemingly minor heart condition immediately disqualified him from service. When Jim desperately pleaded with the military commissar for just one chance to prove himself, the man responded with genuine bewilderment in his voice. "Most young men try everything possible to avoid service. Yet here you are, practically begging to join. That's truly admirable, but I'm sorry, old boy, my hands are tied. I'd be held personally responsible if anything happened. Go, live your life instead. Study, find good work, fall in love. There are countless other ways to serve our society." Study, they all said with casual dismissal, but even after 18 long years, Jim still couldn't envision a clear path forward for himself. He secretly harboured ambitious dreams of becoming a respected sailor, a dedicated police officer, or even soaring through the skies as a pilot. But could someone like him ever achieve any of these lofty goals? His self-doubt ran impossibly deep, constantly reinforced by others who had carelessly labelled him since childhood as the fool. He could never find the strength to defend himself against these taunts because, as the gruff orphanage cleaner had repeatedly declared with disdain, he was hopelessly spineless. His one meaningful achievement in life was finally securing a modest one-room apartment from the state. He gradually settled into this tiny space, managed to find steady work as a construction labourer, and maintained that physically demanding job for several challenging years. life seemed to be slowly improving. He even found what he believed was love. At least, he convinced himself it was genuine love. Nancy, a seemingly kind-hearted girl, worked diligently at a local pawn shop. She moved into his life quickly, and they appeared to live together in perfect harmony. When he accidentally discovered she had a young child being raised by her aging parents in a distant village, Jim, ever the gentleman and driven by his own painful childhood memories, insisted she bring her son to live with them and earnestly suggested marriage. Having grown up in the cold emptiness of an orphanage, he intimately understood a child's desperate need for maternal care. It felt fundamentally wrong to keep them separated. Nancy readily agreed to the marriage proposal, but carefully pointed out that this cramped one-room apartment would be far too small for 3 people to live comfortably. She cleverly suggested selling Jim's apartment and using the substantial money as a down payment for a proper mortgage on a larger place. Completely unfamiliar with the complex legal intricacies of property ownership, Jim trustingly allowed her to handle all the confusing paperwork. This blind trust proved catastrophically misplaced. By naively signing documents without proper check, he had unwittingly made Nancy the sole legal owner of his only possession. She wasted no time in selling the apartment and coldly evicting him from what had once been his sanctuary. She didn't do the dirty work herself. Instead, 2 menacing thugs forcefully removed him from the premises, making it crystal clear that any resistance would result in an extended stay in the hospital or something far worse. Though Jim immediately rushed to the local police station, seeking justice, everything was frustratingly legal and binding. According to the papers he had foolishly signed, he had officially gifted his apartment to Nancy, and she could legally dispose of it however she wished. And yet, Jim gathered his courage to stand up for his rights. With determination in his steps, he marched into Nancy's workplace and started arguing. But his weak attempt at justice was cut short when security personnel forcibly removed him from the premises. That same evening, in a dark alley near his temporary residence, the same threatening men caught up with him. Their brutal conversation left Jim with severe injuries that required an entire month of hospitalization. Despite police involvement, the perpetrators were never identified or apprehended. Upon his discharge from the hospital, Jim found himself in an impossible situation. His employers had terminated his employment, so the construction site trailer that had been his modest home wasn't available for him now, and his former co-workers, though sympathetic to his plight, avoided any contact. That first night of homelessness found Jim huddled on a cold park bench. In the days that followed, he discovered a network of underground shelters in various building basements, moving from one to another as circumstances required. Through sheer determination, he managed to secure part-time employment as a manual labourer and maintenance worker. When work was scarce, he learned to identify which store dumpsters contained salvageable food items, though this survival strategy often led to confrontation with other desperate individuals seeking the same resources. Street life in some way hardened Jim. He learned to survive in this world, yet not civilized, but at least so. However, despite his circumstances, he maintained an unwavering commitment to his personal standards, meticulously maintaining his hygiene, steadfastly refusing both alcohol and the companionship of other homeless individuals, and carefully allocating his meagre earnings toward essential items and sustenance. While his wardrobe consisted mainly of discarded clothing from waste bins, he took particular pride in occasionally purchasing new socks, a small luxury that helped him maintain his sense of dignity. Through it all, he clung tenaciously to the belief that his circumstances were temporary, that somewhere on the horizon waited an opportunity for positive change. In addition to other part-time jobs, Jim often went to the dump. Although there too everything is tough, all the heaps are literally divided between other brothers and sisters in misfortune. But Jim managed to snatch his piece, where he occasionally found non-ferrous metal which he sold to a familiar bargainer. On this morning Jim approached the dump with no expectations. He had missed the prime scavenging hours when fresh deliveries arrived, and he knew other collectors would have already combed through the most promising areas. Nevertheless, he maintained a glimmer of hope that something valuable might have escaped their notice. Like many in his situation, he often entertained fantasies of discovering hidden treasures, perhaps a misplaced suitcase filled with money, or an antique chair concealing valuable secrets. Though reality typically offered nothing more exciting than damaged furnishings, worn-out textiles, and occasional pieces of scrap metal. The junkyard appeared deserted when he arrived, exactly as he had anticipated. He methodically searched his usual territory before venturing into less familiar areas, acknowledging the likely futility of his efforts. Suddenly, his probe made contact with something unusual. His pulse quickened with familiar anticipation. Could this be the moment when his persistent dreams of a treasure finally materialized? Carefully extracting the object, he found himself holding an elegant woman's handbag. With mounting anticipation, he began his inspection. While cash seemed unlikely, he allowed himself to hope for jewelry or other valuables. He was deeply disappointed when the purse was empty. No money, no accessories, not even scattered coins at the bottom. He nearly discarded it immediately. After all, what use was an expensive accessory in his circumstances? Yet something made him hesitate at the last moment, and he decided to keep it, if only because it seemed wrong to throw away something so well made. Jim crumpled it in his hands, and then his fingers fumbled for the hidden zipper inside. Opening it revealed a folded sheet of notebook paper. Jim expected to find mundane contents like a shopping list, cooking instructions, or perhaps a romantic message. Instead, his eyes fell upon these words. "Help! I'm being held at some summer house. From the window I can see railroad tracks. A train stops here at 8:30 every morning for 2 minutes. Jim stood frozen, his mouth agape at this extraordinary discovery. His first impulse was to simply dispose of the note and continue with his daily struggles. He certainly had enough challenges without involving himself in mysterious circumstances. However, a sobering realization struck him. He might be the only person who could offer assistance to someone in genuine peril. The handwriting in the note was smooth and neat. Jim concluded that it was probably written by a girl, especially since the bag was a woman's. Jim always had a keen sense of justice in his character, though he had never been able to defend himself. Yet, while he had failed to protect his own interests, perhaps he could succeed in rescuing another person from harm. For a brief moment, his mind wandered to practical considerations. Surely there would be some compensation for helping in such a situation. But he quickly dismissed these thoughts as unworthy. The true value for him lay not in any potential reward, but in the opportunity to assist another human being in dire circumstances. Jim moved decisively from the junkyard, clutching the note and bag. He headed straight for the police station, where a uniformed officer stopped him at the door. "Hey, where are you going?" the officer asked. "I have a statement," Jim replied, holding out the purse. "I found this at the dump." "So?" The officer wrinkled his nose in disgust. "There's a note inside saying someone is being held captive." The officer paused, then sighed with a smirk. "Are you drunk or something? What note? What nonsense is this?" "It's right here." Jim reached for the note, but the officer pushed him firmly away from the door. "Get out! There are no kidnapping reports in town. We'd know. What are you standing there for? Leave!" Found a bag, did you? I'll throw you in the drunk tank, and we'll see where you really got it. You stole it, didn't you? No, Jim stumbled backward. I found it. Then count yourself lucky, the officer said with a laugh. Jim knew he needed to leave. The two officers stood nearby, watching the exchange with interest. As he walked away, he overheard their conversation. Miguel, what did that bum want? One called out. Who cares? I'm not letting him mess up my statistics. It's month's end and he shows up with this nonsense. Probably drunk with his buddies playing detective. Looks like delirium tremens. No surprise there. They're all like that, their colleague added. Jim felt crushed by their disbelief. They'd driven him away like a stray dog. The worst part was his inability to help the captive woman, despite his desperate wish to do good. Then inspiration struck. He could handle this himself. He just needed to figure out how. Sitting on a park bench, Jim unfolded the note. Though it lacked an address, it mentioned the summer house as a landmark. The train, location was now key. The train stops at 8:30 in the morning. But which train? He had a lead. Now he needed to check a schedule. Jim racked his brain for solutions. A phone would help, but his was long gone, lost or stolen, though it wouldn't matter with no money on his account. Then it hit him. The station's electronic train map would have everything. So the man headed to the station without delay. An hour later, he knew the name of the station where the train stopped for 2 minutes at 8:30. Unfortunately, there were no more trains today, so Jim asked the ticket cashier how he could get there another way. But the woman, who seemed disgusted by the homeless man's appearance, angrily hissed that she was not a reference bureau and that giving out such information was not part of her job description. A storm was raging in Jim's soul. He wanted to cry out, "People, help! A person is in trouble!" But he remained silent as people hurried about their business, some rushing to catch trains, others returning from trips with heavy suitcases. No one noticed the poor soul in his thin, worn jacket as he tried to figure out how to get to the station he needed. "How long are you going to stand there?" a voice suddenly said near his ear. Jim flinched and looked up. Before him stood a broad-shouldered man in a janitor's uniform. "Sorry, I'll be right out," Jim replied sheepishly, rising from the bench. "I'm just trying to figure out how to get to the village. If not by train, then at least by bus." When the janitor heard the name of the station, he smiled kindly. "Funny coincidence, my grandmother used to spend every summer in that village, growing tomatoes and cucumbers. My family sold the cottage later. There's a bus stop across the street. Your bus is number 45. Jim glanced uncertainly toward the station exit, then thanked the man and turned to leave. "Hey, do you have a bus fare?" the janitor called after him. Jim shook his head. That was the simple truth. "Here," the man said, pressing a few bills into his hand. "This should cover your fare and maybe a snack for the road." The shuttle bus arrived quickly. Throughout the journey, the other passengers eyed Jim's ragged appearance but remained silent. The driver paid him no mind. After all, the man had paid his fare. People got on and off along the way, while Jim stared out the window, lost in thought. What would he do when he arrived? He couldn't just stand in the village centre shouting, "Who's locked up here?" He'd have to inspect the cottages, risk being mistaken for a thief. They'd either call the police or take matters into their own hands. Though Jim increasingly felt helpless, he pressed on. Finally, Jim stepped off the bus at a shabby stop. Beyond lay the cottage village, modest summer houses interspersed with a few imposing mansions. A typical Dasher settlement. Fortunately for Jim, there were no residents. It was mid-October, and the last of the gardeners had harvested their crops and departed. Only stray cats and dogs remained, abandoned by their negligent owners. He knocked on doors and peered through windows, but no one answered. Walking down the street, Jim eventually sank onto a bench near one of the houses. He was exhausted, hungry, cold and directionless. Everything was pointless. He wouldn't find anyone here. Where would he sleep tonight? What would he eat? What a fool he'd been, giving in to this chivalrous impulse to rescue some phantom victim. There was no one here. Then he heard a car engine. Jim caught sight of the car, pulling away from the only luxurious cottage in the area. Could the victim be there? The railroad was visible from that side. It was worth investigating. Jim decided to examine the mansion's grounds. After the car disappeared around the corner, he approached the gate and pulled. Locked, of course. A security camera loomed on a nearby pole. Jim surveyed the neighbouring plot and realised he could access the yard undetected through it. The fence there was lower, just wooden boards with no visible cameras. Jim smirked. These rich folks think thieves only use the front door. But he wasn't a thief. He was on a noble mission. Gathering his courage, he scaled the fence and surveyed the yard. The yard was empty. He jerked open the front door. Locked. "Hello?" he shouted into the keyhole, pressing his ear against it. Silence. Then Jim went to the outbuildings. "Is anyone alive?" he called out several times. Only pressing silence answered. Then came a noise from an old barn that stood out among the newer buildings. A faint knock sounded from inside the door. "Help!" came a woman's voice, quiet but tearful, as if drawing its last breath. Jim rushed to the doors. They were sturdy, secured with a huge padlock. "Hey, can you hear me?" Jim shouted. "How did you get in there?" "He locked me in. Help!" the female voice called back. "Did you write the note?" "Yes, help!" The woman's voice suggested she was close to fainting. There was no time to waste. Jim scanned the area for something to break the lock, but found only well-manicured lawn grass everywhere. He circled the barn and spotted a small window under the roof, barely large enough for a cat. Then his eyes fell on a small crowbar leaning against the neighbouring house's wall, alongside a shovel and rake, clearly forgotten by careless owners. What luck! In moments, Jim had retrieved the crowbar and returned to the barn door. "Are you all right in there?" he called out. "Bad! Help!" came the barely audible response. Jim attacked the lock with the crowbar. Though unusually strong, the lock finally gave way, and he swung the barn door open. A short, frail girl collapsed into his arms. "Thank you," she whispered through blood-cracked lips before losing consciousness. Jim carried her back the way he had come. As he reached the road, he saw a police car approaching, lights flashing. It turned out not all the village residents had left. An elderly woman had spotted what she thought was a homeless man prowling around, peering through windows and doors. Frightened he might be a thief or worse, she had called the police. The officers, seeing Jim with the unconscious girl, ordered him to surrender, or they would draw their weapons. "I haven't done anything bad," he mumbled. "I only wanted to help her." "Save it for the station," the officers replied, roughly handcuffing him and putting him in their car. They waited for an ambulance to take the girl to the hospital before driving to the station. At the station, Jim explained why he had come to the Dasher settlement. "You're spinning fairy tales," the investigator scoffed. "To hear you tell it, you're Poirot or Margret himself. Come clean. How long have you been casing those houses? Where's your stash? Or have you drunk away all the proceeds? What did you do to the girl?" "I'm Jim Squibb, just an ordinary man," he replied steadily. "Not a thief, not a murderer, not a rapist. I went to your colleagues first, but they dismissed me, so I acted alone. I found the girl. How is she doing?" "Still unconscious," the investigator said curtly, "but the doctors expect her to recover. Don't think you're off the hook. Her testimony will sink you for sure." "I look forward to hearing her story," Jim said.
You might want to investigate the house's owner while you're at it. Are you, the worthless vagrant, trying to tell me how to do my job?" The investigator's face flushed with anger. He called the duty officer, and Jim was taken to a holding cell. Jim went quietly and obediently. Truth be told, he was grateful for a warm place to sleep. When they brought him dinner, cold porridge and a piece of bread, even that seemed a blessing to the unfortunate man. In the morning he was awakened by the clanking of keys. The door to the cell opened, and yesterday's interrogator peeped in. "What, you asleep, vagabond?" The detective grinned. "Get up, you're on your way out." "And where am I going now?" Jim resigned himself to his fate. "You're going home," the investigator smiled. "I'll draw up the paperwork now. The girl told me everything, it's not your fault." In his office, the investigator briefly informed him that Jim was no longer suspected of anything. "And did they find the one who held her?" Jim inquired. "Found?" the investigator replied dryly. "And you're still a witness. We wrote everything down from your words. If we need anything, we'll find you." Jim understood the reason for this uncertainty. There was negligence for law enforcement. He had reported the kidnapping immediately, but they hadn't believed him. However, Jim didn't want to prove anything. They hadn't arrested him. The girl was saved, and that was enough. Walking out of the police station, Jim breathed in the crisp fall air. It was over. He had done it. Saved someone. Sure, they hadn't believed him at first, and no one had even said thank you. It stung a bit, but it wasn't terrible. The main thing was that the girl was safe, and Jim now knew something about himself. He wasn't a coward. Though he had nowhere in particular to go, he slowly moved away from the police station. An expensive car stopped nearby, and a middle-aged man got out, walking quickly toward the door. For some reason he stared at the vagrant. Jim paid little attention, but after a couple of minutes he heard a shout. "Jim! Jim Squibb! Stop, please!" Hearing his name, he froze and slowly turned around. On the threshold stood the investigator and the same man. The latter headed toward him. "Jim, it's you!" he exclaimed cheerfully. "I'm here on behalf of Leslie. I want to thank you." "Leslie? Thank me?" Jim muttered confusedly. "Yes, I'm the father of the girl you saved yesterday. If it hadn't been for you, it's frightening to imagine what might have happened. Let's go to the car." The man gestured towards his vehicle. "There's no need to," Jim mumbled. "Are you hungry?" The man looked at him thoughtfully. Jim lowered his eyes. The only porridge and bread from last evening was all he'd had in 24 hours. He was hungry, but he wasn't used to begging. Even homeless, he had always earned his own food. Reading all these thoughts on Jim's face, the man resolutely took him by the arm and led him firmly toward the car. Jim obeyed. "We're going to a good place. They have great food there," the man said, starting the engine. "My name is Mr. Faustino, by the way." Jim. "I know," Mr. Faustino laughed. "The investigator told me. Oh, Jim, I'm so glad I caught you. You're a real hero. Thank you." "I didn't do anything special," Jim replied modestly. "The main thing is that your daughter is safe." "Well, not quite safe. She'll have to stay in the hospital for a while because of that jerk. She's dehydrated and has pneumonia, but the doctors say it's not critical. You got there just in time. Just one more day, and that would have been it," Mr. Faustino said, driving confidently. Jim was silent, only nodding in response. He wanted to ask questions. Why the girl was in the barn? Who had kept her there? But he was too shy. Mr. Faustino would tell him later. At the entrance of an expensive restaurant, Jim hesitated and tried to refuse, but the man again took him firmly by the sleeve. "He's with me," he told the guard. He was surprised, but let it pass. It was clear that Mr. Faustino was well known here, and could afford some oddities, even bringing in a homeless man. Sitting in a private office, surrounded by the exquisite dishes,
Mr. Faustino had ordered, Jim learned his entire dramatic story. Mr. Faustino owned a successful business with several branches in different cities. He had a wife and a student daughter, and life was good, until a week ago, when his daughter Leslie didn't return home from university. They searched social networks and called all her friends and acquaintances, but no one knew anything. Just as they were about to contact the police, they received a call. An unfamiliar male voice informed them that he had Leslie, warning that if they wanted to see her alive, they shouldn't involve the police. The stranger demanded Mr. Faustino's entire business, everything he was worth, in exchange for Leslie's return. When Mr. Faustino explained this was impossible to do immediately, the kidnapper gave him a week's deadline. Despite the warning, Mr. Faustino contacted a familiar detective for advice. The detective promised to track down the kidnapper, but agreed they shouldn't go to the police. A few days later, the detective claimed to have found where Leslie might be held, but the lead proved false. Meanwhile, the kidnapper kept calling with reminders and demands. As time ran out, the girl's father began preparing documents to sell his business, too terrified for his daughter's life to contact the police. Then suddenly, he received word that Leslie was in a city hospital. When he and his wife arrived, Leslie was already conscious and told them everything. That day she'd left the university and encountered the detective her father occasionally hired for minor matters. His name was Nigel. He was about 30, and the naive 20-year-old girl had taken a liking to him. When Nigel offered her a ride, she accepted. During the drive, he gave her a cup of coffee, and after that, she had some kind of blackout in her memory. She awoke in a cold shed. It was night, she was terrified, and her phone was missing from her coat pocket. Though she screamed for help, no one heard her. By morning, exhausted on the damp floor, she was startled awake by a train horn. Through a wall crack, she spotted a railroad nearby with a passenger train at a stop. Leslie checked her watch, which thankfully remained on her wrist, and memorized the time. Using some empty crates, she managed to peer through a high window, discovering she was being held in a farm building within what appeared to be a Dasher settlement. After analysing her situation, she decided to write a note to throw from the window. Finding a notebook and pen in her purse, she described her surroundings in case the wind carried her message far away. Just as she finished writing, she heard footsteps. She quickly tucked the note into her purse before the door opened, revealing Nigel, no longer the charming man she'd known, but a monster. When Leslie tried to scream, he taped her mouth shut, bound her hands, took her purse and left. She didn't see him again for days, though she heard him visit the Dasher occasionally and approach her door, likely watching through a crack. He never entered or spoke to her. It seemed he was simply waiting for her to perish. After several days, she managed to free her hands and remove the tape, but her voice was gone, and she lacked the strength to make noise. Having had neither food nor water all this time, she'd developed a fever. Just when she thought it was the end, she heard an unfamiliar man's voice. Before losing consciousness, she rushed to the door, remembering only that she saw a destitute man, probably homeless, but she didn't care. The main thing was that he was a man. Then, darkness. She woke up in the hospital. Nigel was detained this morning when he tried to flee at the airport after returning to the village and finding Leslie gone. Finishing his story, Mr. Faustino said, "I never expected him to do that. I trusted him, and he almost destroyed my daughter." "Why did he go through with it?" Jim asked. "Surely he must have known that even if he got the money, he couldn't escape. Leslie would tell everything." "He wasn't planning to let her live," Mr. Faustino replied, his voice filled with pain. "As for the money, trust me, that creep would have figured something out. You stopped his plans. You don't realize what you've done for us."
You saved both our daughter and our business. The money doesn't matter. What matters is that Leslie is alive."
Mr. Faustino fell silent for a moment before asking,
"Now tell me, young man, what's happening in your life?"
"Not much," Jim replied sadly.
"I've been searching through dumps, which is where I found Leslie's purse."
"Well, that was fortunate," Mr. Faustino exclaimed, then quickly added, "But I was not asking about the situation with finding the purse. Jim, I gather you have nowhere to live. Why is that?" Jim briefly shared his sad story. Mr. Faustino listened carefully before offering his help, something Jim hadn't expected but gratefully accepted. Mr. Faustino started by renting an apartment for him, helped him buy clothes and arranged a job for him. Though it was only as a courier, it was just the beginning. Mr. Faustino also promised to help Jim enroll in college after summer. He could work and study. There was still time to catch up if he had the motivation. And Jim did have the motivation. He discovered his calling, to become a lawyer. He stayed friends with Leslie and found true love with Sarah, a nurse at the local hospital where he had had his medical check. At first he couldn't understand why Sarah loved him, a poor man without a good background. He even asked her about it. "What a silly thing," Sarah laughed. "You're the best man in the world. I feel safe with you." These words gave Jim renewed strength. Now he knows for certain that he's not worthless, and he will succeed. Being at the bottom isn't the worst thing. What's worse is having no chance to rise again, having no one extend a helping hand. And in that, he's been fortunate.